writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, a podcast about writing. I'm Brian Moritz. Today's guest is Drew Montreuil from Finger Lakes Weather. Drew Montreuil, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So this is exciting. It's weather talk. So if you're a weather nerd, this is your episode. And it's always good to talk to a fellow Oswego person.
Yeah, I'm real happy to be here. I definitely enjoyed my time up in Oswego, and I was able to get up there this summer actually and visit and tour the new science building and everything. So that was pretty exciting.
Oh yeah, the science building opened up. So you graduated in 2011, was that
yes.
right? Okay,
yep.
And I started in 2014, and the science building I think it opened my first year. So they're finishing it up my first year or not. So did you have the thing where you walked in and be like, oh, this is great. It would have been great if I were here.
Oh yeah, yeah. When I was there, it was back in the old Pease Hall, and then basically hadn't been touched since probably the 60s or 70s. So it was, your typical old college building, but it got the job done, and definitely still has a special place in all of our hearts. But the new science building is really awesome.
Yeah. So because it's Oswego, I think I'm contractually obligated to ask you, what is your sub shop order?
I didn't do too much sub shop, believe it or not.
All right.
I kind of stuck to the dining halls a lot of the time, and I lived at the Mackin complex for probably half of my time there. So
okay.
I enjoyed the variety and made to order stuff down there a lot.
My confession is I've been working at Oswego since 2014, and I've never been to the Oswego sub shop. I'm amazed they let me stay on campus, actually.
Hey, there you go.
So we're not going to talk Oswego the whole time. I wanted to talk to you about your website, Finger Lakes Weather, which if you live in central New York, upstate Western New York, I'm sure you know about right now. It is, I said this before we started recording. It's the best weather site, I think, out there. I mean, it's fantastic. As someone who commutes from the Rochester area to Oswego during the winter, it's a lifesaver to me. So thank you for all of that, first of all.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of my passion project, so I get a lot of enjoyment out of it, and the fact that other people find it useful and can help them in their day-to-day life and decisions just makes it all the better.
Yeah. How did it start?
It actually started way back when I was in high school still. I was a junior in high school, and I'd always been interested in the weather, so everybody always knew I was going to be a weatherman. So every time there was threat for, decent snow, I get asked a couple hundred times a day if we're going to have a snow day the next day. So I finally got tired of it and was like, I'm going to make a website and just put my snow day stuff up there. But I didn't even get the website built before I had changed plans and was doing daily weather forecasts. And it started just in my hometown, Groton, and the surrounding areas. And I kept that going through my 4 years at Oswego. And then once I was done with that and worked on my master's at Cornell, I expanded it to all the Finger Lakes. Started off with basically just a map of the region and a couple weather icons, a couple temperatures. Then there was a 7-day forecast. Then in 2014 is when I added the current kind of daily blog format. And then I've just been adding features more and more through the years since then.
And for we'll get to that kind of more about the site and the writing on it in a second. But for anybody who's not familiar with New York State, I mean, the Finger Lakes is a pretty big region. I mean, if you look at a map, if you think of a map of New York State, it's like basically that whole middle chunk from like basically Syracuse out almost to Rochester. That whole middle chunk is generally the Finger Lakes region. And I think what's so useful about your site is that, and I wonder if this fueled your site anyway. It's a weird, like, between media outlets place. Cause like, it's not quite Rochester, it's to the east of Rochester, but the west of Syracuse. So it's kind of like a weird media no man's land.
It is. And that definitely was a big kind of factor in how things have developed. The weather in the Finger Lakes is so unique with the topography and the lakes and, depending on what weather or what direction the weather's coming from, can do totally different things. So It's not Syracuse weather. It's not Rochester weather. It really is its own kind of in between area that really deserves and needs kind of that real local approach and attention.
So you said earlier on that you were kind of always kind of like obsessed in knowing about weather. So where did that come from? Like, how did you start as a kid being the weather guy?
I don't really know too much where it came from. It's just always kind of been there. I know my older brother was pretty interested in weather. He's a pretty good weather nerd as well. So I probably picked up some of it from him and his early interest. He's 3, 4 years older than me. Um, but for whatever reason, it just latched on to me as an obsession. I can remember being 4 or 5 years old and just being glued to the Weather Channel or doodling my own little weather maps on paper. I feel like I even wrote a tornado warning one time for Binghamton just for the fun of it. Had the whole city wiped out or something. So it's always been there with me. I guess it's just part of who I am.
All right. So I lived in Binghamton, so I was gonna make a joke there, but I'm gonna pass on it. So in 2014, you kind of start the daily blog part of Finger Lakes weather, and I want to talk about how you write about weather, because not only is it incredibly useful, but I find it incredibly interesting and refreshing. And we're going to get into comparisons with other weather outlets in a few minutes, probably naturally. But how would you describe kind of like the tone of Finger Lakes weather and of your writing?
Well, I definitely try to keep jargon out of it. So I try to keep it understandable for the public. And if there's a time where I need to use some more technical terms, I try to explain them. So I definitely try to, keep in mind my audience and who I'm talking to. But I try to make it a bit educational so that people can really understand what's going on. And I try to be as descriptive as possible so that people know exactly what to expect. Kind of one of the best examples I have is with my precipitation forecasts. Most other weather outlets are going to say there's a 60% chance of rain today. Well, what does that actually mean? And there is actually a technical specific definition for what that means, but nobody knows what it is, especially not the public. So instead of saying there's a 60% chance of rain, I'm saying, there's going to be a line of showers. It's going to come through during the mid-afternoon. It'll last for an hour or so. That gives people a lot better idea of what to actually expect, as opposed to just some obscure percentage.
Right. And what is that definition?
I'm not even 100% positive what it is. I think it's something along the lines of if it's a 60% chance of rain, that at any given spot on 60 days out of 100 with those conditions, it would rain.
Okay.
Which is, just this technical, convoluted gibberish that doesn't really mean a whole lot.
Right. It's funny to kind of prepare for our interview today. I reread one of the chapters in Nate Silver's book from a few years ago, and he wrote about weather forecasting, and it was more framed around Hurricane Katrina. But he talked a lot about that, and it is that weird kind of mixture of science and real life, right? Like you have this mathematical model and this concept, but now, okay, 60 times out of 100 it's going to rain. So should I bring an umbrella today? And that's got to be the translation that you're looking for, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So I was wondering too, like you talk about how you get to the site and started writing the site. What was missing from weather coverage in the Finger Lakes specifically, but even maybe in general? What was missing and like that brought you into that? Brought you into it? Like, what wasn't there that you're like, I can do this?
Well, I think it's just I've always kind of had my own style of doing things, like I was just explaining, with how I explain the weather and try to teach it, or, get away from the percentages, for example. And a lot of that actually goes back to my time at Oswego. I always kind of had that style. But a couple of professors that I worked with, especially Dr. Scott Steiger, who's still there doing a great job, he really stressed not hyping up storms, not jumping on them too soon, and keeping the science in it, and how to communicate that with the public. Um, so it kind of fueled what I already had, and just some frustration with the media, and you know hearing people talk about weather events as they're coming in, based on what they're hearing in the media, and it's like, well, that's not really what they're saying. And it kind of developed a sense in me that the public isn't really understanding what meteorologists are saying,
Okay.
and that in turn kind of erodes the trust between the public and the meteorologist. I mean, everybody's heard the weatherman jokes, and there's some truth to some of them.
Okay. How much? How
um,
much? How much do you hate those?
I get a laugh at them sometimes.
Okay. Okay.
um, but it's interesting because I can make a bad forecast and people don't jump all over me like they do the other people, because probably because of the way I explain things, and I try to express what sort of uncertainties there are and what other possible scenarios might happen. So when things do go wrong in a forecast, people are like, that's okay, I understand, because they know some different things to expect, and they understand that it's a science and not entertainment.
hmm When you talk about the kind of frustrations you saw in the media, what were they? You don't have to be, if you don't want to be specific to a specific market, that's fine. But in general, in terms of weather, what does traditional media, tend to do wrong or do a poor job of?
Well, one of the biggest things is the weather hype,
Okay.
which is really just out of control now that social media is a big thing, and things get shared thousands and thousands of times. Um, a perfect example is not this past week when the storm actually happened, but 2 weeks ago. Um, we were 7 or so days away, and both small news outlets and large national outlets were calling for this huge snowstorm that was going to blow up along the northeast coast and bury everyone from the Ohio Valley through the Mid-Atlantic and into the Northeast. Um, and they were basing it off of just this little snapshot of a possibility rather than looking at the bigger picture and everything that was actually going on. And so I was telling people 5-6 days in advance, this isn't going to pan out to be anything, especially not up here. And it ended up being a moderate storm, dumped. I think the highest spot was in Lake Missouri, which isn't anywhere that anybody was talking about originally. So they got a foot, and then across Virginia maybe 6 inches, which for Virginia's a decent deal, but there was nothing through most of the metro areas, and so all this hype was worked up, and nothing ever came of it.
Right. And it's got to be a challenge too for you, because then when you have a storm, like as we're recording this past weekend in Western New York and Central New York, we did have a pretty good winter storm. I think we got like 1.5 feet of snow here where I am, and it's spread out across the region. And so like, do you find that is there at all a boy who cried wolf situation where kind of if everything gets hyped up, then when a real storm comes up, people are slow to act on it or slow to realize it's coming?
Absolutely, there definitely is. And even in the aftermath of this storm, a lot of the forecasts, my own included, were calling for a bit more snow that fell. And, people were saying, where was this big storm? It's like, well, it still was a big storm, but because it didn't quite reach, the pinnacle of what it could have been, people were starting to complain about the cry wolf syndrome. And there is a real danger in that as well, because when there is a big storm coming, people aren't going to listen.
Right.
Um, Hurricane Sandy along the East Coast in 2012 is a fairly decent example, because that was a really unique and dangerous storm at kind of a time of year where people weren't necessarily expecting it. And it was very, very well forecast, 5, 6, 7 days out. But still, there was a tremendous number of people who found themselves needing to be rescued. There were a number of fatalities and stuff, and there just really isn't any reason for that because it was so well forecast. So, it makes you wonder, okay, what's going wrong? Are people not understanding the forecast, or are they just not believing them?
Right. And it's interesting because that's one of the things that Nate Silver pointed out in the book. It's like for all the weatherman jokes, if you don't get the weather right, like just using this past week as an example, we knew 6 days out, like there's probably going to be a pretty big storm coming this past weekend. And that's kind of remarkable to know, being able to know like 6 days out, like there's going to be some snow. You can kind of see it coming as opposed to like 2 days out or something like that. So I'm wondering if you could go back we use this past storm as kind of a reference point, but when how do you do a weather forecast? Like what goes in, like what's your actual work process? Like what do you look at both for short term and those longer term things?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the most important things, and I explain this when I do like presentations at schools and stuff, is that, putting together a weather forecast is like a big giant puzzle. And if you don't do all the parts and you miss some of the pieces, you're not going to get a complete picture. Mm-hmm. And again, this goes back to Dr. Steiger at Oswego. He really drilled in knowing what's going on right now, looking at the current conditions and understanding what the weather is doing currently. And that's kind of the base of everything else that happens. Okay. If you don't know what's going on now, how are you going to know what's going on in the future? Mm-hmm. So when I'm making a forecast, I do a tour of the satellite and the radar and the different surface observations and some other data sources that give me a picture of what's going on right now, not only here, but also especially to the west of us where our weather is going to come from. From there, then I go into the different computer models that simulate the weather. There are dozens of computer models that show pretty much everything you can imagine: snow, wind, temperature, humidity. And so you have to be able to sort through all that data and pick out what's good and ignore what's not good. So that's quite the process. And you have to kind of know the models themselves and be able to anticipate what they're going to do. So for example, with this big storm, a lot of times in the winter when there's a big storm coming, the models early on are kind of all over the place. One model might have the storm missing 150 miles to the south, then it'll go to the north 100 miles. But usually there's kind of a pattern where they start to come to an agreement, and then about 3-4 days before the storm arrives, they all jump down to the southeast.
Okay.
And so the middle of last week that happened. And I hadn't put out any actual amount forecasts yet, but some of the other news outlets had been. And so they all jumped way to the southeast with this storm. And people started asking me if it was going to miss us. And I was like, no, it's still going to get us. And sure enough, then the models started creeping back to the north and west, right over us. And, that's what happens. So it's a matter of, there's a lot of experience that goes into a weather forecast. Being able to, like I said, sort through the models, figure out what's good, what's not. Just because a computer says it's going to do something, if the science of how the atmosphere works doesn't agree with that, well, I'm going to go with the science over what a computer says.
Right.
And, a lot of it is also what has happened in past situations. No two storms are alike. But there are certain storm tracks and certain patterns that come up time and again. And so that all it's kind of an abstract idea that kind of gets wrapped into a forecast. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you got to make sure you get all the pieces in to even really have a decent chance at a halfway decent forecast.
And one of the things in this past week that you did that I'd like to talk a little bit about was you acknowledged, I think Monday or Tuesday, that the storm is coming, but you put out a special update on your site. I remember it might have been Monday night. Mm-hmm. And Yep. It was I'm not talking about this storm until Thursday. There's going to be no snow map, nothing until Thursday. And that's so kind of it was refreshing, but it's also, I got kind of counterintuitive from a media perspective because people, the first question is, how much snow are we going to get this weekend? And people start asking that this weekend. And you were kind of steadfast in saying, I'm not talking about that till Thursday. So I thought that was an interesting decision. What went into that?
Well, a big part of it is because I knew the models were going to be waffling all over, especially early in the week. And they were, even the same model from one run to the next run of it, the storm would end up in totally different places. So there was not really any consistency to base a good forecast off of. And I knew that was going to be the case, at least through probably Tuesday. And then I wanted an extra day or two to really see, okay, the models really are focusing in on this idea. So it was mostly just kind of taking my cautious approach to things. The other part that went into it was, and this hasn't really ever bothered me too much until really this winter, is I only wanted to put out one, maybe two versions of a snow map with this storm. I really wanted to have some consistency in my forecast, rather than change it every 6 to 12 hours and jump all over with the snow amounts.
Okay.
And I think that was helpful for people to really get an understanding of what to expect. Because if there's a population out there, let's say there's 1,000 people out there that I'm trying to reach, 500 of them might see my update on Thursday, 500 others might see it on Friday, and there's a small, maybe 200 of those that it's an overlap, and so half the population is seeing my snow map from Thursday. And then if I change it and put out a totally different snow map on Friday, the other half of the population has a completely different idea, and some of that original population isn't going to see the update.
Right.
And so that just breeds confusion and frustration, and I saw that a lot in a lot of the comments I was getting. People are saying, "Oh, well, this meteorologist is saying this, and somebody else is saying this, somebody else is saying this, and nobody really knows what's going on." And so, I was trying to have that consistency so that people could, get the information and have kind of a stabilizing source in all that confusion.
Well, I would imagine too, there's, from a production perspective, it would be, if that consistency would be important just from if you're always kind of chasing a model, then you're never done and you're always kind of like, kind of tweaking and going back and forth. And there's got to be some, kind of like the dog always chasing its tail rather than kind of like, no, this is kind of what we think it's going to be rather than mix it too much, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, there's a balancing act because, if there was new data that came in and things really did change and look different, yeah, you'd have to put out a new forecast. But I was, kind of trying to anticipate what the models were going to show in the future, and make my forecast based off of that.
I wondered too, when you were mentioning about your audience seeing it, some on Thursday, some on Friday or whatever, how much does the Facebook algorithm kind of mess with you in that regard, or social media sharing mess with you in that regard?
Oh yeah, definitely. On a normal day, I've got over 13,000 people following me on Facebook. I can even look and see how Facebook is showing my post today, since today's a pretty tranquil day, what I would call kind of a normal weather day. Maybe over the course of the day I'll get 4,000 people shown. And I've got 3,600 so far today, so that's a pretty good amount. So Facebook's only showing it to a relatively small section of the people who follow me. And the people it'll show it to tomorrow aren't the same as the ones it'll show it to today. And then sometimes Facebook will show really old stuff to people. I did live video streams for the snowstorm we got in November, and I continually have people commenting on that, even, up until a week or so ago, and they're telling me it's raining. It's like, okay, well, this storm was 2 months ago. So finally I had to like edit the post in big all cap letters saying this storm was in November. So it, it's tough to deal with Facebook sometimes. That's really the main social media I deal with. I do have a Twitter and I put my stuff there, but I don't put nearly as much time into Twitter as I do the Facebook stuff. So you got to kind of play by Facebook's rules and do the things they want you to do. But that's a big reason why I've been pushing my email list lately, to get people to sign up on that and kind of cut out the middleman of Facebook, and so people can actually get the updates that they want to get, but Facebook may or may not actually give them.
Right. And it's funny when you think about the kind of media environment we're in with social media. You mentioned this, you've mentioned this a few times, but it's interesting that for, I think, a lot of mainstream weather outlets and mainstream media, the incentives lend themselves, I think, to a hype forecast. You get more shares, you get more clicks, you get more attention, if you're calling for big snow or potential big snow or storms or whatever. And I'm wondering, do you find like I know you brag about, and you brag rightly about your no hype forecast. Is that kind of your incentive to kind of like counter that, do you feel like?
Yeah, and it really does work. By being the anti-hype, I kind of get all the same benefits as the people that hype it up.
Right.
But I get the added satisfaction of, not crying wolf and, staying more true to the science of everything. But yeah, so just the way social media works, the more clicks and shares something gets, the further it's going to spread. And, weather hype is a great way to do that and get those clicks and everything. So, there's definitely, I'll call it a temptation. There's definitely a temptation to want to do that. And, especially places that rely on advertising revenue, which, is me included, they want the clicks on their website. They want people going there because that's going to make the advertisers happy, and that's what's going to pay the bills. So, yeah, for a lot of the media outlets, that's kind of what their business model is right now, because that's what's going to get them the most money.
So one of the great things that from this storm we had this past weekend was, like you said, your snow map was a little high for what actually fell. I think you had, just to use me as an example, I think you had us in the 20, 22 inch range, and we were at about, I don't know, 14, 15, whatever. And one of the posts you had that was interesting was you couldn't wait to kind of go back and look at what happened and what you could learn from it. And I'm wondering, I know it's only a few days out, but have you had a chance to do that? And what did you learn from the difference in forecast on this storm to what actually fell?
I haven't had a chance to go back real thoroughly yet. What I like to do a lot of times is take the Weather Service reports and plot them on a map and basically overlay it on top of my map and, see what areas I did well in, what areas I didn't do well in. But the sense I get is kind of across the board, I was too high on things. And already the sense I get is there's kind of two factors in that. One is the storm didn't put out as much precipitation as the models were saying.
Okay.
I think if you melted down the snow, it would come out to generally around an inch of liquid. So it would be like an inch of rain fell with this storm. I was expecting more like an inch and a quarter. So that was one factor. The other factor is the ratio of the snow to that liquid and how quickly the snow piled up. I was expecting the snowflakes to be a bit bigger and fluffier and therefore pile up quicker, and that didn't quite happen. The flakes stayed relatively small and a little, not the big puffy lake effect flakes.
Right. It was that like fine misty snow. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of the grainy stuff, and that's not going to accumulate and pile up as fast. So I think those two factors combined wrecked some havoc on my forecast. And hindsight's 2020. I feel like you know, I should have known that because every time we get one of these storms, the flakes never get real big and fluffy, and um, so it's always real interesting, and every storm really is a learning curve, especially the ones that don't go according to plan.
Right.
And I was telling people on Sunday when they were waking up to only 10 inches or so, and they're like, "Well, what happened?" I was like, "Hey guys, this is science. Science doesn't do what you want it to."
Right.
So,
And so what do you I know it's still early, you haven't really done a deep dive on the data yet, but what do you, from an experience like this, and it's saying it in an experience makes it sound dramatic. I don't think anybody was super upset that we got a foot of snow instead of 2.
No.
But how do you then apply a lesson like this to the next storm system that's coming up, maybe next month or in 6 weeks or so? How do you apply lessons from past forecasts, good or bad, to the future ones?
Well, it's kind of in how I'm going to interpret the models. And, this goes back kind of to a lesson I've learned in other storms, is that the models tend to overemphasize the cold air with these storms. Or on the flip side, they underestimate how much warm air gets wrapped into them. And I learned that lesson the hard way a couple of times with those storms that kind of flirt on the edge of snow and ice and rain, and it's just a big mess. And with those storms, if you don't get the rain and sleet right, it's going to totally bomb your forecast because that'll kill the snow accumulations real fast. So I believe it was while I was at Oswego just doing the small website, there were a couple of storms that I busted pretty badly on because I didn't have that experience yet. But coming into this storm, I was like, oh, well, there's plenty of cold air. I don't have to worry about the warm air because there's no way we're going to get any mixed precipitation with this. And that was true. But, next time around, I'm going to take another look at it. It's like, well, okay, even though it's really cold, maybe those snowflakes aren't going to get as big as I think. And, maybe there isn't going to be as much precipitation coming along this storm path, which was more from the west as opposed to up the coast.
Mm-hmm.
So, those are some things to take an extra look at next time around.
I ask every guest on my podcast this question, so I'll ask you. I know this is your busy time of year, so I don't know what your answer will, I'm interested to see what your answer will be. What's the best thing you've read lately?
The best thing I've read lately? I haven't done too much reading lately, which is unfortunate because I had gotten back into reading pretty good. I worked at a library for the past 5 years.
Okay.
So I kind of had to do some reading. But there's a couple books I'm working on right now. One of them, my friends got me. It's A Fantasy Life by Matthew Berry, talking about fantasy football and stuff. Kind of makes that one comes to mind because you're talking about Nate Silver, and he also does a lot of kind of sports related statistics and stuff.
Right.
So there's that one. I've got a couple religious books I'm reading. Try to increase my faith a little bit in some areas, and I've got 3 kids, so I'm constantly reading lots of picture books to them, and still reading some Christmas books
Okay.
for them, even though we're getting towards the end of January now. Occasionally one of those will come off the shelf.
What's your kid's favorite right now?
It's funny. One of my oldest is in kindergarten, and my middle one is in the full day pre-K, so basically like a grade below him. And last week, my kindergartner brought home a book about a dog and a little pet parade on Wednesday, and I read it to him. And he took it back on Thursday, and then Friday, my middle child comes home with the exact same book. I was like, dude, we just read this. So they like books with animals, and like I said, they're been into the Christmas books a lot. That's starting to taper off a bit, but animals, robots, rocket ships, things like that. Lego books.
Right.
They like those ones.
Excellent. Drew, if people are interested in your site and in your work and in supporting you, where can they go?
flxweather.com, or they can look me up on Finger Lakes Weather on Facebook.
All right. Well, Drew, thank you very much for your work and for joining me today. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Brian.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.